Hey cuties, welcome to the Dark Side of Perfect. With the start of summer coming up, I thought that today would be the perfect opportunity to tackle one of my favorite subjects and one that I've been waiting to talk about on the podcast, which is personal curriculums. And before I talk about why summer is important and why that matters to me, I want to talk about a couple of other things. So let's talk about it. With summer coming up, it is the perfect time to start something new. And every summer since I was a kid, I have done what I call an independent study. And I was doing this before personal curriculums were really popular. But once they started becoming popular and I was watching videos on them and trying to figure out what people meant by a personal curriculum, I realized that it's kind of the same thing. So I'm going to use the word independent study. I might say personal curriculum. I'm using those interchangeably. And it's something that's very important to me and very important to my progression of learning. Obviously, I really love learning new things and challenging myself and exploring new avenues of education and literary arts and science and things like that. So, this is going to be my take on personal curriculums and independent studies. And with summer coming up, this is the perfect time to talk about it because I actually haven't decided on my independent study for the summer yet. And so I thought that we could talk about it. I could use it as kind of an example to work through how I'm setting up my independent study for this summer so that you might get inspired to set up your own independent study for this summer. But before I talk about how to set it up, how to pick an independent study or a personal curriculum, whatever you want to call it, I want to talk about why this is important to me, just so that you can kind of attach any meaning that you want to a personal curriculum and have your own inspiration for wanting to do it. But I think it's important to look back on how this impacted me and my family as a kid as I was growing up and kind of see the importance of it and why I continue it to this day. And that might give you a little bit of context before we jump into the sciencey nitty-gritty why it's important. And then we'll jump into how to get started, how to pick one, and how to set it up. So when I was little, my family would do themes of the month. It wasn't just in the summer, but in the summer it was a little bit more intense because we weren't in school, obviously. So we were able to do more stuff. But we had themes of the month to explore different ideas, like Artuary, where every February we would go to art museums and explore different artists, different art styles. We would talk about art history, and it would be just this amalgamation of art. And we would go to these different art installations wherever we were living at the time. And so that was a really specific one that we did every February. And then we would filter through math and science projects and doing different experiments for science. Obviously, with my chem major, I have always been very interested in science. So we always did different experiments based on my dad and I made a really intricate pulley system once and I painted the pulleys purple and we used it and then I presented it to my class, even though it wasn't really for a science fair or anything. It was just because we were studying pulleys in my family. And then I did one where I was studying condensation and how plants kind of work, how morning dew works, because I had a question about that. So we talked about condensation and we talked more about plants and how they get water in drought-like situations and trying to figure that out through the experiments that we could do that we found online or we found in science books or things like that. We also did literary exploration. So my mom has a PhD, like I've said before. I have a master's degree. My grandma has a PhD. We're a very educated family. And so with that obviously comes a lot of literary exploration. So almost every night at dinner, or maybe once a week at dinner, twice a week at dinner, we had this little philosophy book. And my mom, instead of saying grace or anything like that, she would open up this philosophy book and she would read a passage from it. And it wasn't always the philosophers giving their philosophy things. Sometimes it was just ideas that were kind of out there that you haven't thought of before. And then we would spin dinner talking about whatever our days and stuff, but then we would also talk about this philosophical idea and what we think it means and how it could apply to our lives and how it could apply to our days. And when I was a kid, I really did not appreciate that. No one in my family did. We were like, oh God, she's pulling out the book again. Everyone brace yourselves for a in-depth philosophical discussion when I'm just trying to get through my mashed potatoes. But growing up, I really think that that had a huge impression on me, and it really taught me to value some things about education and to see that, like, you can make a conversation. And it also taught me that you can continue to learn even outside of school and what you are learning, because everything that is important to you is important. And if philosophy is important to you and you want to have a conversation, start that conversation. And so, this independent study personal curriculum, it's a way to continue that conversation with yourself. And not only does it explore something that you're interested in, it makes you more interesting and it makes you more knowledgeable and more well spoken about whatever it is that you're studying. Often in this literary exploration that we would do, if we had a project with it, my mom would have us write papers or stories or poems, and that would be an addition. And then she would look over our papers and read them, and we would talk about them as a family. And it could be about a book we were reading, about a philosophical idea, anything like that. And then we also did like law and conflict. So we would do mock courts, me and my sisters, and we would come up with a case that was kind of relevant to us, like if we were fighting as sisters or anything like that. And then we would have mock courts with my mom as the judge, and we would go through the legal mediation proceeding together. So it was just play. And I know that this might seem weird that these kids and this family were doing this, but I'm dead serious. This is something that we did, and we just saw it as playing. We saw it as, oh, we're going to go to court today and do this. Oh, we're going to read a book and then have a fake book club with our little fake wine, like we're in the Jane Austen book club or something like that. I don't think that movie came out at that time, actually, but the point was there. It was just playing, and it was playing through continuous learning, and a skill that I have taken into adulthood and I think is really valuable to my life is like playing through continued learning. So I stopped doing this for a couple of summers, and then I quickly picked it back up because I realized that I was missing it during the summer. So summer is maybe my favorite season. I love being outside. I like to paddleboard and swim and be in the water, go on hikes, just play with the dogs. I don't have a dog, but I mean, other people's dogs that I see on hikes. You get it. Anyways, last summer, I started picking this back up because of Taylor Swift. And God, I'm so grateful to that woman. So she was coming out with Life of a Showgirl, and she was referencing in Travis Kelce's podcast Hamlet a lot because obviously Fate of Ophelia. And so I realized that we bring up Hamlet so much in our culture, and I'd never read it all the way through. And so I don't understand all of the cultural implications of Hamlet and what all of that means. And obviously it's like a very classic piece because it's written by Shakespeare and we study it in school and stuff. I never studied it in school. We read like Romeo and Juliet and stuff. So I was really interested in expanding my knowledge of Hamlet so that I could better understand Taylor Swift's references to Ophelia and Hamlet in her new album. So I decided to pick up Hamlet. I was really concerned that I wouldn't be able to really understand Shakespeare because I hadn't read him since high school. So I read this No Fear Shakespeare version of Hamlet, which has the Shakespeare on one side and then like the modern translation on the other side. And so I tried really hard to read the Shakespeare side first and then read the modern only if I needed it. And that actually worked out really well. And I ended up writing a little paper about Hamlet and how I thought it was going to apply to the Fate of Ophelia. And then after Fate of Ophelia came out, I did a little bit of introspection on how it related to Hamlet. And now whenever there's a Hamlet reference in TV shows and stuff, I understand where it's coming from, which makes me feel so smart. It makes me feel like that girl. But I didn't just read Hamlet. I studied Hamlet. I read it and then I tried to interpret it by myself. And then I read secondary research and papers and information of the cultural implications and exploratory value of Hamlet. Because when I do an independent study, it's not like reading a book. And I'll get to that in a minute. This summer, I'm thinking I'm between two different things. During the summer, I really love to do a literary one because I can bring a book or research or whatever and read it when I'm camping or I'm out paddleboarding and laying on the sand or whatever I'm doing. So I really like to do a literary one. And this summer, I am between Beowulf and Canterbury Tales. as my independent study and my literary exploration. I'm going to put a poll on Spotify, and I'm also going to put a poll on Instagram if you have any thoughts on this, if you've read them or if you know what they're about. One of my biggest interests in this life is the evolution of the human language. There's this podcast called The History of the English Language, and it talks about the evolution of the English language from Old English, Middle English to Modern English, and how if in Modern English, there's no way you can read Old English. It's like a totally different language. So a lot of people think Shakespeare is Old English. He's not. He's Modern English because you can understand the words that he's saying, even if you don't understand their meaning all the time. So Beowulf is Old English, and it was translated into Modern English. So a lot of the literary study of Beowulf will be the cultural implications of what he's saying. And it's an epic poem, and since it's Old English, I think I'm really interested in the evolution of how we translated it from Old English to Modern English and reading that story and getting to know the culture. Canterbury Tales is very similar. It was written in Middle English, and it's a collection of short stories by Chaucer, if you've ever heard that big literary name. I think it's mentioned in Gilmore Girls, actually. But it's basically in the medieval times, and it's a lot of fiction, and it explores a lot of ideas of social classes and like chivalry and some medieval themes. So those are my two options for my independent study this summer. And why I'm choosing these books is because I could read Pride and Prejudice 100 times, right? I could do my independent study on Jane Austen and read all of her collective works, which I've read most of before. But that only gets me 80% of the way there of what I really want to get out of an independent study. Which brings us to the science part. So lock in because we're going to get a little sciencey for just a minute. And I think it's really important to talk about the science of an independent study because as I was making this episode outline, I was doing research on why I feel this is so important to me and why I don't want to read Pride and Prejudice or Wuthering Heights and do a just study on a classic, why I want to really, really challenge myself with something that I don't understand and something that I need to do multiple different facets of study to really get. Because with both Beowulf and Canterbury Tales, I'm going to have to go to museums. I'm going to have to read secondary articles to understand the cultural implications of the stories I'm reading to really get them. It's not about reading them, it's about understanding them. So I was doing research on why that matters. And it's what I call the 80% thought. And I realized that there's an actual psychological term for that, which is desirable difficulty. And this comes from, I already read. So why would I bother to read something harder? If I read Pride and Prejudice again, and I did my independent study on Jane Austen, then my brain would recognize the syntax and adjust to that pattern quickly, putting me into a kind of autopilot or a comfortability that I know is going to be understandable and easy. Even if it's not the easiest thing in the world, and there's obviously a lot of layers to Pride and Prejudice. That's not what I'm saying. There's obviously a lot of layers and a lot of independent study you could do with Pride and Prejudice if that's something that you really want to read. For me, I've just read it 100 times. So I don't want to do that because it would put me into a level of comfortability and an autopilot, but I really want to challenge my brain. So by choosing Beowulf or Canterbury Tales or Hamlet, I have to work harder. And working harder and putting yourself through that challenge, even if you're going to read Pride and Prejudice, putting yourself through the challenge of reading secondary research, not just reading it, but getting into the nitty-gritty of Pride and Prejudice and really understanding the cultural implications behind the class structure and why Mr. Darcy is so brooding and the way that he is, that will build long-term retention and actually create neural frameworks. So when people talk about neural pathways and neuroplasticity, often in these personal curriculum videos, they're talking about maintenance. They're talking about baselining. They're talking about maintaining what you have so that you don't fall into a brain rot hole and that you keep up with your neuroplasticity so that you can have your brain working for as long as possible. What I'm talking about and what is harder and what makes my independent studies a little bit different from the classic personal curriculums that I've seen talked about is that I am trying to grow my brain. I'm trying to build new infrastructure in there and create scaffolding to hold up things for a long time. Picking a topic outside of your level of difficulty or your desired difficulty creates myelin, which is a fatty tissue that goes around the nerves in your brains, like wraps around the nerve fibers, and allows the electrical passes of your brain to process more efficiently. So it's faster brain work and it protects it better. There's something called a synaptic spark, which is where your brain is like a use it or lose it kind of a deal. It's like when you are learning a language, for example, like Spanish, and you do it all through high school, you study it for years, maybe even you get close to fluent, and then you stop talking in Spanish. Something happens, whatever, you just don't use it anymore. And then suddenly you find yourself in a situation where you need it and you can't even remember like the smallest little idea of what Spanish words are. You don't know the grammar, you don't know the vocabulary. That's because you didn't use it, so your brain deemed it unnecessary and broke down that connection. So your brain couldn't do that synaptic spark. It couldn't make the connection between the neural pathways to help you remember it because you lost the language. With that being said, the more facets, the more things that you have to engage for your study, the more connections you'll make in your brain. So, to get back to my point, I could read Pride and Prejudice. I could write a paper on what it means to me or who Mr. Darcy is or who the Bennet sisters are. I could do a study on that, be 80% there, move on. But I want the synaptic density. I want that connection firing between my neurons. I want to make that scaffolding in my brain and improve my cognitive growth. To connect back to one of my previous episodes, I was talking about productivity and how I've been in kind of what I'm calling a malaise and how it's not exactly a depression, but how it's feeling like you don't have a purpose, right? And how it's feeling like, oh, I'm just going to go about my day, bare minimum. The active learning of an independent study increases dopamine and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which increases mood and mental clarity. Okay, I just Googled this because I felt like I wasn't explaining it well enough, so I'm gonna read to you what Google says. So the brain-derived neurotrophic factor is a vital protein that acts like a fertilizer for the brain. It promotes the survival, growth, and maintenance of neurons while strengthening synaptic plasticity, the brain's ability to adapt and form new connections crucial for learning and memory. And by learning, you rewrite your self-narrative and you move from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. And I've talked about that before, I think. A fixed mindset is very much like I am this and I'm going to stay this and I'm just going to move forward. And that's the malaise is like, okay, I'm fixed. It's straight line within my bubble. Gonna happen. A growth mindset is very much like I'm expanding that bubble and I'm moving my line outwards. And if you are like a scientist and I said anything wrong about the neuroplasticity and what independent studies are scientifically and why they're important, feel free to let me know. Let all of us know because we need to know why this is important for our brains and our brain health. Now I want to move on to types of independent studies. As I said at the beginning, there's a bunch of different things that my family did growing up. So I feel like there's a lot of different types and not all types are created equal. And I think that there's some different levels of what you can do because obviously what I'm talking about with Beowulf or Canterbury Tales is a very high stakes, high impact, high energy independent study. It's very much like reading a very dense book, not written in a language originally that I can understand and was translated, while also understanding culture, looking at art from that time, looking at other works from that time. And then I want to bring it all together in like a capstone for myself. So that is obviously a high stakes one with main activity and secondary research. Then there's like medium stakes, middle stakes one, which is like a monthly theme with one weekly activity that you're going to do. Then there's the lower stakes ones, which is like, I really want to read Pride and Prejudice. I've never read it before, and I really want to read it and know what it's about so that I can understand what people are saying when they talk about Pride and Prejudice. That's a lower stakes one. Totally valid, totally fair. Or like watching a documentary and getting really into like hyper focusing on that for a little bit, like watching The Plastic Detox and then learning about what plastic does to our body. Like that is kind of a lower stakes personal curriculum. So those are the stake levels, and then there's the different types. So there's academic, which is like a literary study, a science study, philosophical, spiritual study, math, coding, language, anything academic. And I have a friend who did a independent study a little while ago on the Bible, and he isn't religious, but he did do a full independent study on the Bible, and he read the whole thing, and he looked at boards and different papers and different cultural things of the time so that he could really understand what the Bible is talking about because we reference it so much. So that would be an example of like a spiritual one. Or there's so many aspects of life and so many aspects of learning. And honestly, you maybe don't even know what you want to do right now. But basically, those are like the academic ones, is learning something within an academic space and really digging into that. The second one is a season theme. So like Artuary and exploring art in February, or like garden July. And in the summer in July, you want to learn everything about gardening. You want to take a composting class and you want to learn about invasive species and you want to learn about what you can plant in your garden, what's edible and what's pretty, and how to best take care of your garden. I don't know, that's just a theme for July, is something that you want to learn about. And it's a little bit of a lower stakes or middle stakes project. And maybe you have your weekly activities that you're going to do or your classes that you're going to take so that you can learn more about gardening. Then around Christmas, you could learn more about the cultures of Christmas around the world. Or Thanksgiving, you could learn about different countries' Thanksgivings, because obviously the United States has their classic Thanksgiving. But other countries also celebrate like Independence Days, and they have alternate holidays that the United States doesn't have. So maybe exploring things like that. The third one is creative or physical independent studies. And I do want to count this because I think that when we think about personal curriculums, independent studies, we think academic. That's the one that we stop at. We think, okay, literary, science, philosophy, spiritual. But I think that creative and physical really counts too. It's a way to break out of the 80% standard hobby and creativity and physical and really push yourself to another limit. You're learning a new pattern style. You're creating new pathways in your brain. You're doing a hobby deep dive. So for some examples of this, because I know it's kind of harder to grasp onto because it's not as like, oh, I'm reading a book and I'm writing a paper about it. It's very much, okay, I crochet. I want to learn how to do a totally different style of crocheting that seems really hard, like lacing or something like that. And it's pushing you past your general crochet hobby and it's pushing you into a new level. Or maybe you really like yoga, but you haven't really been getting into inversions that much. And so you really want to learn how to do a handstand. I did this about a year ago. I wanted to learn how to do a handstand, so I created my little plan and I did that plan until I got to my headstand. And handstands are really hard, and I'm still kind of working on solidifying that, but I do have my headstand, and that was pretty cool. So I worked really hard at that, and it was something out of my comfort zone because I can do yoga every day and feel comfortable doing yoga every day and get the poses that I want. But doing inversions was really hard, and that pushed me past my 80% of doing yoga into something new. Or it could be like learning to climb, learning to paint enacts so many neural pathways, and learning to paint or learning to draw or taking a drawing class or a pottery class, that is a creative independent study. And I count it. Physical, creative, academic, and seasonal themes, and learning about things with your themes increases that neurotrophic factor, which then in turn increases mood, mental clarity, that active learning, which increases dopamine. And all of these ideas, all of these types, because they have these neural connections and these neural pathways, they can help you get off of your phone and they can help you break some of that addiction and tell your brain that you don't need the dependence on your phone because you are able to learn new things without it. So those are the different types and the different levels. And you may be thinking right now, oh, I could read Beowulf or Canterbury Tales because that will make me so smart and it'll make me look so cool. And yeah, that's part of it. Like you get more knowledgeable. You're able to connect references that people make. You're able to have a deeper conversation about them. But I will say that especially for higher stakes projects like Beowulf, Canterbury Tales, the depth that I went to with Hamlet, things like that, that can't be the only reason. Wanting to be smart and wanting to be cool is fine, and that's cool. But if you choose it only to look smart and cool, you will not do it. You will not follow through once the newness of it wears off. Once the, oh, yeah, I'm reading Hamlet wears off. If I choose Beowulf, for example, it's not to be a super cool literary dark academia girly, but because the evolution of languages is incredibly interesting to me and I really love learning about the culture of that time so that I can better understand how the language evolved. So like, yeah, being a dark academia book girly is part of it, and the perception is always part of every decision that we make as perfect girls. But I chose it because the evolution of languages is really valuable to me, and I chose Hamlet to better understand the cultural ideas and conversations around Hamlet, and so I could better understand Life of a Showgirl. And I think that all of those are fair reasons. The starting place of choice must be self-exploration, not performance. No one is going to hold you accountable to your personal curriculum and your independent study but you. Even if you tell people about it, no one's holding you accountable but you. This is your thing and something that's for you. So choose a topic to cultivate self and that self-trust so that you can keep it going even when the newness wears off. Then, honestly, then if you don't truly like the independent study that you're doing, if you're like, oh, this really isn't for me, I need to choose something else, then you know that you made that choice for you. You know that you weren't doing it to be smart and to be cool, but for actual exploration of self and self-growth. Then learning that you didn't like it is something new that you have learned about yourself. And that's always worthwhile. But if you do really struggle with the self-trust and the self-accountability, a good idea is to ask a friend to do it with you, and then you can hold each other accountable. Because then it's still not really about perception, it's about accountability. And if they really like the subject that you want to do, or you really like the subject that they want to do, then you'll have a thought partner to talk to about it with. Because I don't know anyone who's read Beowulf, right? So if I asked one of my friends to read it with me because they're very interested in languages and culture and how that's evolved, and we go to museums together and we read it together, and then we talk about it together so we can kind of talk about some of the nuances of it that are difficult to understand. It's like having a study buddy. And I think that that's totally fair too. So that's just an idea. If you do struggle with the self-accountability, self-trust aspect of personal curriculums and you need someone to push you, ask a friend to do it with you. Ask a friend to go to your gardening classes with you. Ask a friend to go to art museums with you. And then you can talk about the culture around the art, and you can talk about the different styles and their favorite style versus your favorite style. And I think that that's a great way to approach it. Okay, so we've talked about why it's important, why it's valuable, why scientifically and brainily it's valuable, and we talked about the different types and how to kind of approach it from a self-trust aspect. So now that we know all of the back end, let's talk about where to start and how to start doing it. So the first thing is to figure out what you want to do, be realistic about your timeline, and figure out how deep you want to go into it. Because for things like Hamlet, you can always go deeper. You can always look harder. So do you want to read it? Do you want to understand the characters? Do you want to understand the plot? Do you want to understand the culture? Do you want to look at all of the secondary research for it? How deep do you want to go? And then set a realistic timeline on how long that'll take you. Because obviously, if you have a 9 to 5 job, you're not spending all day focusing on Hamlet. You're going to read 20 minutes of it a day. And then once you finish a scene, you're going to look at some different articles and stuff. So think realistically about what that means for you. I really like using the summer because I feel like it's a good amount of time to do it. So like the 2, 3-ish months of summer. And then I can do it outside. And that just gets me motivated. Then you want to figure out your end goal or your end project. So it's one thing to read Hamlet and look at the implications of Hamlet. It's another thing to turn it into an independent study where you then pull together everything that you learned so that you can, I don't know, look back on it in the future. Or maybe if you want to talk about it with someone, you can be like, oh, I actually wrote a paper on this subject. Let's talk about it. It doesn't have to be published. It can just be for you. And if you don't want to write a paper, that's fine. Whatever. Don't do that. I sometimes will write a paper. Honestly, a paper feels like a strong word. It's not like a double-spaced Word document. It's like a little journal. Sometimes I'll get a new notebook for my independent studies, and I'll write down my thoughts as I'm going through it. Or, like, if I see something on a secondary research, I'll be like, oh, that's cool. I'm going to write that down. And then I just kind of compile all of those thoughts together at the end in my notebook so that I can have the idea of what I was going to. And writing things down instead of typing them actually increases your neuroplasticity. So it'll increase the learning connections in your brain. So then, as you're writing down your thoughts and as you're writing down your research, it'll help you make those connections more. So it won't just be passive reading, it'll be reading, then writing, and making all of those connections in your brain. And then it'll help with that longer retention of what you learned so that you can actually be like, oh, I do remember writing that down. Here's my source that I'm citing right now to you in this conversation. So there's doing that. There's doing a board. If you're doing like a science project, I love making a little science board on Canva, and I'll just make like little whiteboards for myself of my little science projects. Then there's a presentation. So my family at Christmas every year, we do a presentation on something that really spoke to us that year, and so that we can teach the family about it. Obviously, we're very education focused in my family, so that we can teach my family about it. So for example, last year, my grandmother did the history of the Kris Kringle markets in Germany. So she did a lot of research on German Christmas culture and Christmas markets and the history of them and did that presentation. I did mine on the history of the English language, and my dad did his on Bitcoin and what Bitcoin is and how to get it and why it's important. So it can really be about anything. And then there's also, like, if you're learning a language or something like that, then maybe you go on a trip where you have to utilize that language. Or if you're doing a coding project and you're learning coding, then maybe your final outcome is going to be doing a coding project. If you're learning a new crocheting pattern, maybe it's creating something for someone else with that pattern. There's like 100 different end goals and projects that you could do for all kinds of different things. So it just depends on what you're doing, what you want to do, how much time you want to put into it. But having an end goal will make it feel more real, number one. And number two, having an end goal will make it feel more final. So then you won't just feel like you're reading Beowulf until the end of time. It'll feel like, okay, this is the final thing that I've done for this, and I feel really accomplished. And it'll help with that sense of accomplishment and that sense of achievement and that dopamine that you need to keep doing things like this. The third thing is, how are you organizing this? So are you going to do it on your iPad? Are you going to get a new journal? Are you going to Notion it? Are you going to use a bunch of index cards on a wall? Like, what is your organization system for setting this up? The fourth thing is, make a list of, if you're doing a high stakes one, make a list of supporting research. Or if you're doing a lower stakes or a middle stakes one, make a list of things that you need to know or figure out. Make a list of documentaries you need to watch. Make a list of artists that you think you may be really interested in and want to go see during Artuary. Make a list of classes in your area. Maybe do some research on classes in your area for your gardening July, or maybe a class about Spanish, or maybe a class about pottery. And then with all of this, I really like to just brain dump ideas. I like to write down, okay, I'm doing this independent study on Hamlet. What is some supporting research that I think I need to know? And then I'll do some Googling and be like, okay, what is some supporting research that to understand the context of Hamlet that I need to look at? Or if I'm trying to figure out how to compost, okay, let me write down all of the things that I think I need. I need to go to classes. I need to get supplies, things like that. So I just kind of brain dump everything that I think, and then I'll do some Googling to figure out what else I need to add to that list. And then the fifth thing is, sort these things and these ideas into your timeline. So I really like to write this down, and you can think of it as a syllabus, but it's kind of like that. I guess it's like a timeline of ideas and what you're going to do throughout your independent study and what ideas you're going to hit. But I think of it more just like kind of as a cute organization system that I can look at. And I usually write it on my iPad, and then I'll print it out so that I can have a hard copy with me. If you're watching this on YouTube or Spotify, I will put my syllabus that I did for Hamlet up on the screen, so you can see it here as an example. If you are not watching the video, then I will put it on the Dark Side of Perfect's Instagram. So basically, I try to make this really cute and make it exciting, something that I want to look at. I don't type up a black and white document and call it a day. I really like to add color, and I like to add bubble letters, and I like to add little drawings to the side of like themes like little flowers or hearts or whatever I'm doing, little ghosts for Hamlet. I don't know. So basically, how I set it up is I figure out my timeline. So I write at the top the title of my independent study, and then I write kind of what I want to get out of it so that I can recall that and I can come back to it of like, oh, this is why I'm doing this. And then I'll write my little timeline of like, timeline about 4 weeks, about 2 months. And I always write about because things happen, life gets busy, and sometimes this doesn't take a first priority, and self accountability is really hard. So I try not to stress myself out about it too much. I do like to put the timeline just so I can see, but I'll just pick up where I left off the last time. So sort these ideas into your timeline and then so write the timeline and then write week 1 or day 1 for shorter projects. And I don't put a date. I never put a date because that makes me feel way too pressured. And then I feel like if I miss the date that I fail at my independent study. So I don't ever put a date. I put week 1 or day 1 or idea 1, task 1, whatever. I do that. And then I do my reading that I want to do or the exploration that I want to do, then the context that I need to look at the supporting research that I maybe want to look at, or if there's any ideas. And sometimes I leave this blank if I'm doing something like literary because I don't know what I'm going to need. So then I'll just write like a little header that's like context, and then I'll write what I think the context should be after I finish so that I can keep track. Or you can write like after your exploration, your supporting idea of what would support you if you do know what you're looking at. Like if you're studying Spanish and your first thing is to learn the whole alphabet and numbers and classic sayings like where's the bathroom, your supporting idea could be like, okay, now let's think about grammar and how to apply the grammar to those sayings or something like that. Then I write goal and why this week matters to encourage me. And then I write another encouragement. I usually write like an affirmation or the brain areas being used because that really pushes me. I love to think about what parts of my brain are being used. Or I write the vibes and just like kind of what I'm feeling about this goal and what I want to get out of doing my little scapula push-ups so that I can get to my handstand. Things like that. And then I always have a little space for reflection. And like I said, I usually put this in a journal. I'll make my syllabus outline on my iPad, but I usually always transfer it to my journal now that I'm thinking about it because I always need the space for reflection. And so the syllabus is really just a guiding, and then the journal I really like to use for my reflections and my space to do that. So, like I said, I'll put that on my Instagram, the one that I used for Hamlet, if you want to use it as inspiration. But really, the independent study, like I said before, is about you, and it's about progressing your own knowledge and your own journey. If you don't want to make a syllabus, don't. If you want to go on vibes, great. If you want to just write down your brain dump ideas, great. I just noticed that having a detailed structure like this helps me stay inspired and helps me stay motivated to continue going since I am doing it alone. And so I need something to hold me to it so that I can look back at. As perfect girls, obviously, we love and hate rules. And with the independent study, there are no rules but one. There's one rule. I'm so sorry. And it's important and you have to follow it. So if you are doing your independent study and you realize this is not for me, I don't like reading this. I don't like the book. I don't like this project. I don't understand why I'm doing this anymore. I thought it would be fun, but the newness has worn off, and I realized I was doing it for performance, or I realized that this is not for me. If you decide that you want to do something else, or you totally complete your study, you're done. And you're feeling like, okay, I did that. I'm so proud of myself. I'm going to go get myself a treat and take myself out to dinner. No matter what the outcome of the independent study is, the rule is that you recognize that the goal, no matter what the study was, the goal was always exploration of self, not completion of a choice. This was never about completing the goal. This was never about making a choice and sticking to it. This was about the exploration of self and holding yourself accountable enough to realize that you can do hard things or that you didn't like something. And then you learn that about yourself. This is always about exploration of self because, like I've said before, the question of why are we on this earth doesn't have an answer. The answer is to explore ourselves and to be individuals and to be humans. So the independent study, everything that I've talked about today is about the exploration of self and about the continuation of knowledge and learning and hobbies and ideas that interest you and make you feel human, not the completion of some choice that you made. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope that you learned something about personal curriculums and independent studies and how I approach them and maybe got inspired about how you can approach them too. I know this was a lot to unpack and there's a lot of other things to talk about, and it may be hard to apply some of the things that I talked about to your specific independent study. So if you have an idea of something and you want to talk about it, feel free to DM me on Instagram or comment on this video and we can talk about it in the comments like a little community. Just a reminder, I'm going to have a poll on Spotify between Beowulf and Canterbury Tales if you have an idea of which one I should do, and I'll also put a poll up on the Instagram as soon as this episode comes out. If you wouldn't mind rating and following the podcast or subscribing on my YouTube channel, any interaction really does help. Comment your independent study that you are doing this summer or something that you are feeling really inspired to start doing. If you want to follow the podcast on Instagram, it is darksideofperfect.pod. That is darksideofperfect, P-O-D. I hope you're finding joy wherever you are today, and I hope that you are learning something new wherever you are today. Sincerely, a fellow perfect girl. I will see you next time.